Let's set the scene. Donald Trump, gripping a podium like it's the last branch before a fall, delivers another delusional monologue. This time he's surrounded by the highest-ranking military brass in the country. Real leaders and real patriots, not the Mar-a-Lago Buffett crowd. And what does Trump do? He launches into a fantasy where facts go to die. A litany of lies dressed up in red, white, and pure nonsense. This wasn't a policy address. It was ego therapy in uniform. You know it's bad when even the stenographers are rolling their eyes. Here's why this wasn't just another Trump word salad. He wasn't talking to Fox and Friends or a crowd of election deniers. He was addressing the top of the military food chain, men and women who spent decades leading troops through war zones, not whining on Truth Social. And what did Trump serve up? A buffet of falsehoods, including one golden lie that President Biden never praises the military. That's not just wrong, it's insultingly wrong. Biden was honoring service members before Trump could spell CERFI. But facts are hard when your worldview is built on grievance and cable news outrage. And then came the emotional striptease. Trump can't resist. He bragged again about how he built the strongest military as if he personally forged tanks in a gold-plated garage. He sneered that Biden's never said it. Never. But here's the problem. Reality. Biden has said it repeatedly, but Trump isn't interested in facts. He's interested in echoes. He needs the roar of affirmation even while standing in front of people who could dismantle his delusion with a single stare. And someone finally did. That's when things went nuclear. The room didn't just witness a speech. It witnessed a rupture. This wasn't a meeting. It was a collapse of command. Picture it. A secure room inside Marine Corps University, the place where national security doctrine is forged, not feelings. And yet, Donald Trump walked in expecting deference and got detonation. A Navy admiral, tired of pretending the emperor had medals, looked him dead in the eye and said, what the Pentagon has been whispering for years, you're a disgrace. Not behind his back, not in a memoir, years later, to his face, on the record in front of witnesses. That wasn't rebellion, it was revelation. The chain of command snapped. Trump, the man who sells himself as the alpha of alphas, melted faster than an MRE in the desert. He slammed the table like a toddler, denied dessert, then stormed out. No words, no rebuttal, just rage and retreat. And what followed? Not applause, not outrage, silence. The kind of silence you hear when something sacred breaks. Those weren't bureaucrats at that table. They were warriors, decorated officers, lifers, and they sat frozen watching the supposed leader of the free world run from a 5-word sentence like it was enemy fire. What does that tell you? And right when the truth was cracking through the marble, guess what? Interrupted a plug for alternative news, because nothing says journalistic integrity like monetizing a meltdown. Let's cut the nonsense. This isn't about which outlet you trust. It's about whether you trust your own eyes. You saw a president collapse under the weight of truth. You saw a military officer risk everything to say what needed to be said. You don't need a newsletter to decode it. You need a spine. So ask yourself, when a commander-in-chief runs from his own command, who's really in charge? Let's take a breath, because right after the drama at Quantico, the video pivots into, of course, a desperate pitch to join the We're the Real Truth Club. You know the script, anti-Dia rant buzzwords about honesty and a wink at the conspiracy crowd. But here's the kicker. Trump doubles down, still clinging to the lie that Biden has never said, we have the strongest military, as if repeating it makes it real. Newsflash, Donnie, Google exists. Biden was praising the troops long before you figured out where the Pentagon is on a map. One quick search, and there it is. Biden 2023, the strongest military in the history of the world. Not vague, not casual, a direct statement, repeated, documented. But Trump doesn't do facts. He does fantasy cosplay where he's the lone guardian of American strength, waving a Space Force flag like it's a Marvel spinoff. And now, like clockwork, he's inventing the claim that Biden wanted to cancel Space Force. Not adjust it, not restructure it, cancel it. That's the play. Fabricate a threat right in to stop it and hope no one checks the transcript. Spoiler alert, we did. Let's slow this down. The military runs on one thing. Order, not tweets, not tantrums. Chain of command. It's sacred. Every Marine, every sailor, every soldier learns it on day one. So when a president turns that chain into a necklace of narcissism, it breaks more than protocol. It fractures trust. That's what makes the Quantico explosion so seismic. A decorated admiral didn't just snap. He upheld the one thing Trump never understood. Integrity above rank. You can fake strength in a speech. You can't fake the respect of the people who carry rifles under your name. When a senior admiral stares down the commander-in-chief and says, "You're a disgrace," it's not theater, it's a fire alarm. That doesn't happen in peacetime. It doesn't happen unless the rot reaches the rafters. This kind of breach signals a total system overload. Military leaders don't go rogue for fun. They do it when the rules were already broken from the top. When silence becomes complicity, someone stands up. And this time the person who stood up wore stars on his collar. From what we now know, this wasn't heat of the moment anger. It was precision detonation. The admiral didn't lose his temper. He made a choice, a moral one. He called out the president's repeated insults to service members. He named the disrespect. He exposed the gap between Trump's flag-draped rhetoric and the reality behind closed doors. And let's be honest, he wasn't the only one thinking it. He was simply the first in uniform brave enough to say it out loud. That should terrify Trump more than any courtroom subpoena. And how did Trump respond? Like a man completely out of his depth, like a CEO caught bluffing to his own boardroom. He couldn't debate, he couldn't deflect, so he did what weak men do when confronted with strength. He broke. This isn't just about Trump's ego. It's a red warning light for civil military collapse. The president is supposed to command with respect. The generals are supposed to advise without fear. But when fear becomes the default setting and trust disappears, institutions begin to eat themselves from the inside out. There used to be an unspoken rule: politics stops at the Watt's edge, and even more so inside the chain of command. Presidents and generals weren't expected to agree on everything, but they were expected to serve the same country, not the same ego. But now that bond is snapped. What we're seeing isn't disagreement, it's detachment. Military leaders, people who served under Reagan and Obama alike, aren't just raising eyebrows. They're throwing red flags. They're staring down Trump like he's a rogue asset inside the system. The dam is already broken. Quiet resignations have become tactical retreats. Generals who once planned invasions are now planning their exits, not because the mission changed, but because the mission stopped making sense. And behind those closed doors where diplomacy once ruled, they're not whispering anymore. They're speaking plainly. Disgrace to his face, no briefing, no sugarcoating. That's not dissent. That's a verdict. And the fact that it's coming from within the ranks should terrify anyone who still believes Trump has control over the institution he supposedly commands. And don't kid yourself. This wasn't some one-off outburst at a base in Quantico. This was the combustion point of a slow-burning fire. The military has been grinding its teeth for months. Take Admiral Alvin Holy. He wasn't just another officer. He ran operations in the Caribbean, a region Trump wanted to turn into a testosterone testing ground. When Holsey pushed back against reckless orders, the White House didn't blink. They doubled down. So Holsey left voluntarily early. And when decorated commanders walk away mid-tour, it's not policy. It's a crisis of conscience. Trump didn't just clash with military advice. He bulldozed it like a toddler in a tantrum tank. Report after report paints the same picture. A president pushing battlefield fantasies cooked up on cable news operations that violate strategic logic, directives that make lawyers flinch and generals grimace. And through it all, he treats the military like stage decor, flags, uniforms, salutes, all props for the Trump show. The armed forces aren't supposed to be a reality TV backdrop, but for this guy, they're B-roll for the next campaign ad. But here's the part that made this detonation inevitable. You can't keep pulling pins and expect the grenade to stay quiet. Officers held their tongues until they couldn't. That meeting at Marine Corps University was supposed to be another controlled script, a sanitized huddle over priorities and briefings. Instead, it became the battleground where reality finally sucker-punched spectacle. Tension had been simmering like a quiet mutiny. And that day, the lid blew clean off. No protocol, no difference, just raw, unfiltered revolt, face to face. And the Admiral, he didn't blink. He didn't hedge. He looked Trump in the eye and called him out, not for politics, but for dishonor, for degrading the dignity of those who wear the uniform. He didn't speak in code. He didn't soften the blow. He called the man a disgrace, right there out loud. And what did the self-anointed generalissimo do in return? He fled. He didn't argue. He didn't rebut. He just rage quit the room like a kid kicked out of a video game. This wasn't a command decision. It was a meltdown in uniform. The moment Trump slammed that table, he wasn't asserting dominance. He was surrendering it. You don't walk out on generals unless you've already run out of answers. And when he stormed off, he didn't just leave a room. He left a crater in the middle of military protocol. The officers didn't chase after him. They didn't flinch. They sat in stunned silence because they realized what every American needs to face. The commander-in-chief had abandoned the command. That wasn't a tantrum. It was a man unfit for the room he walked into. But this wasn't lightning out of nowhere. The forecast had been ugly for months. The tension between Trump and senior military leaders had escalated from frustration to fracture. And Admiral Holtz's early retirement wasn't about age, it was about integrity. When a man who spent decades in uniform decides that stepping down is safer than following orders, something is broken beyond repair. Civil-military relations aren't strained anymore. They're hanging by threads. And while Trump's campaign still wraps itself in the flag, the people who actually defend it are quietly walking away. And here's the part no one wants to say out loud. The troops are tired, not of war, not of sacrifice. They're tired of being used, tired of seeing leadership treat them like props for cheap applause lines. This confrontation wasn't just personal. It was systemic, a reflection of how deep the resentment has grown among those in uniform. And if this is how a president behaves behind closed doors, what does that say about the illusion of control still being sold to the public? Headlines call it a clash. Let's call it what it is. Collapse. Let's get something straight. Military officers don't walk into a room and unload on the president. That's not how the system works. The armed forces are built on discipline, not drama. They follow civilian command, even when it's frustrating or reckless. The culture is rigid and hierarchical for a reason. It's meant to prevent chaos, not invited. So when an admiral calls out the commander-in-chief in a room full of officers, that's not rebellion, that's collapse. That's the signal flare you can't afford to ignore. Normally, when the brass disagrees with the president, they keep it behind closed doors, quiet memos, chain of command channels, strategic side eyes, and classified briefings. And yet, despite all that structure, despite decades of precedent, this officer blew past every firewall and went scorched earth. Because Trump had already burned through the credibility of command. When the military's internal pressure cooker explodes in public, it means one thing. The system designed to protect both sides of the uniform has failed spectacularly. And let's not forget the setting here.
This wasn't wartime chaos or an off-the-cuff moment on Air Force One. This was a scheduled briefing at Marine Corps University, a place built for doctrine, not detonation. A standard presidential military strategy session turned into a constitutional earthquake. These meetings are meant to reinforce priorities, build alignment, and sustain trust.
Instead, they got a man so consumed by his own image that he couldn't stomach feedback from the people risking their lives to defend it. If you're wondering what it looks like when command loses control, this was it. These kinds of military briefings are usually tight, agenda-driven, bullet-pointed chain of command, not chain of chaos. But the moment Trump walked into that room, the whole thing derailed like a freight train hitting a minefield. There were no PowerPoints that could hide what was coming. Officers had been biting their tongues for months, swallowing discipline like broken glass. That meeting was the pressure valve blowing wide open. And the Admiral, he wasn't there to smile for cameras. He came armed with truth, and he didn't miss. He came in hard, no soft edges, no diplomatic phrasing, just a direct hit. Trump was dishonoring the uniform. He wasn't just undermining morale. He was corroding the institution from within. The military doesn't throw around the word disgrace lightly, but that's exactly what he called him. Not behind closed doors, not in a resignation letter, right there to the face of a man who loves parades but runs from principle. This wasn't a critique. It was an indictment delivered in combat language in a room full of real warriors. So how did the self-declared tough guy handle it like a fragile ego inside a pressure cooker? He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He detonated. He slammed the table like a petulant kid told there's no more dessert, then stormed out without a word. Witnesses say the silence that followed was heavier than body armor. Grown men in uniform, men who have seen battle and buried comrades, sat frozen. Because what they saw wasn't a commander leading troops, it was a president fleeing accountability. And that, my friends, is what cowardice looks like in real time. This is the man sitting in the most powerful military chair on earth, a chair forged in history, stained with blood, sacrifice, and honor. And what does Trump do when a decorated admiral speaks truth to power? He bolts, not like a leader under fire, like a child who just lost his turn at the playground. That's not courage. That's emotional cowardice wrapped in a suit 2 sizes too big for the moment. And if the leader of the free world can't even sit through criticism from his own generals, then what happens when a real crisis walks through the door. And let's not pretend this came out of nowhere. That moment was the harvest of months, years of frustration brewing inside the officer corps. This wasn't about decorum. It was a reckoning. From mocking PS to whispering insults about the dead behind closed doors, Trump has been gaslighting the military since day one. When someone who's never served claims he knows more than the generals and then turns around and insults their wounded and their fallen, he's not just being disrespectful, he's revealing who he really is. A performative patriot with nothing behind the salute. And don't forget the pattern. He didn't stumble into this. He exploited the military like it was a campaign prop, not an institution built on sacrifice. Flags, uniforms, stadium flyovers. He grabbed the optics and dodged the obligation. He pushed missions the Joint Chiefs found reckless. He toyed with actions that raised red flags in legal briefings. And worst of all, he demanded loyalty not to the nation, not to the Constitution, but to him personally. That's not just unethical. That's authoritarian cosplay wrapped in red, white, and grievance. If you want a case study in how far the dysfunction has metastasized, look no further than Admiral Alvin Holsey. This wasn't a desk officer filing complaints from a cubicle. Holsey ran U.S. military operations in the Caribbean. Real stakes and real command. And what did Trump want? Not a strategy, a stunt. His obsession with crackdowns turned into an unhinged push for anti-drug raids that left lawyers sweating and commanders shaking their heads. Holsey wasn't confused. He was cornered by civilian leadership more focused on optics than operational law. Holsey tried to push back quietly at first. Tactical objections, legal red flags, strategic sense. But you can only say this is a bad idea so many times before realizing you're the only adult in the room. When your boss treats international law like a cable news soundbite, you either fall in line or draw your line. Holsey chose the latter. And that choice came with a cost, an early exit. A career cut short, not by failure, not by scandal, but by principle. He left because the orders stopped making sense. And staying meant selling out what he spent decades upholding. Let's be clear, this doesn't happen. Four-star admirals don't walk away because they dislike the tone of a memo. They know the rules. Civilian leaders call the shots. Military brass offer counsel, not commands. But when that sacred balance starts to resemble a dictatorship in uniform, professionals face a choice. Serve the Constitution or serve the man in the mirror. And when that gap between duty and delusion grows too wide, you either speak out or disappear. Holsey chose to walk. But what happens when the next one stays silent? When an officer walks away from their command? It's not just about orders. It's about thresholds. At some point, the mission stops being military. It becomes moral. Admiral Holsey didn't flinch at danger, strategy, or sacrifice. What he couldn't stomach was working under a president who treated integrity like a nuisance. His resignation wasn't a reaction. It was a diagnosis. The entire civil military structure under Trump had gone septic. Trust was gone. Communication had devolved into chaos. And when generals stop whispering and start confronting the president to his face, you are not in normal territory anymore. You're in constitutional triage. And all of this unfolds in the shadow of Trump 2025, the sequel nobody asked for, but everyone is watching in horror. His campaign is a carnival of camouflage, fake medals, stage flags, hollow promises to support the troops, but dig beneath the surface. And it's clear this isn't about defense, it's about control. He has repackaged military loyalty as political branding wrapped in stars and stripes and powered by grievance. The campaign isn't courting the military, it's hijacking it one stage salute at a time. He brands opponents as soft as if diplomacy were treason and war were show business. But the men and women actually running the machine see right through it. They don't see a warrior. They see a man addicted to optics and allergic to reality. They see recklessness masquerading as strength. They see a commander-in-chief who doesn't want advice. He wants applause. And worst of all, they see a man who treats the Pentagon like a campaign prop, not a cornerstone of national security. That's not leadership. That's cosplay and a red tie. What used to be whispers in Pentagon hallways are now turning into full-throated declarations. And no, these aren't MSNBC pundits or cable news loudmouths. These are admirals and generals, the kind of people who salute the flag at dawn and bury comrades at dusk. So when they look a president in the eye and say, "You're a disgrace," that's not a partisan jab. That's an institutional alarm bell. And for voters who still care about national security, this should feel less like politics and more like national triage. These officers didn't wake up one morning and decide to play politics. They've served presidents of both parties. They followed orders from people they disagreed with quietly, professionally, and with honor. But this moment broke the mold. When a career military leader is willing to gamble his rank, his reputation, and his retirement just to call out the man at the top, you should be asking yourself what's happening behind the scenes that we're not seeing. Because if this is what they're saying publicly, imagine what's still locked behind secure doors. And here's the part MAGA world doesn't want to process. The very people with first-hand access to Trump's military decision-making, the briefings, the intelligence, the contingency plans, are the ones most alarmed by his judgment. But instead of addressing the substance, Trump's defenders retreat into their favorite fantasy, the deep state. As if a bunch of lifelong officers suddenly turned into political saboteurs overnight. No, what they turned into is terrified. Not of losing power, but of what happens if they stay silent one more day. The deep state myth might sell t-shirts, but it doesn't survive contact with reality. These aren't operatives in a smoky back room. These are career officers, people who served through both Bush administrations, through Clinton, through Obama, and even through the chaos of early Trump. They didn't suddenly wake up and join the resistance. They saw a commander-in-chief turning the Constitution into confetti. The confrontation at Quantico wasn't staged rebellion. It was the final flare fired by professionals who saw this ship veering off course and finally decided to shout Mayday. That moment wasn't theatrics. It was a line crossed. Highly decorated officer trained for war, diplomacy, and survival stood up not on impulse but on principle. And if that doesn't raise alarm bells, you're not listening, because this goes beyond one man's tantrum. It forces us to ask a harder question. Can the U.S. military still function under a leader who treats their advice like background noise when respect dissolves at the top? What happens to the spine of the entire force? Here's what happens. Generals stop speaking plainly. Colonels start censoring briefings. Captains pull punches. Why? Fear not of enemies abroad, but of retaliation from the West Wing. Strategy turns into guesswork. Discipline slips into silence. And morale, it doesn't just decline, it implodes. When the troops see the brass ducking eye contact with their own president, the message is unmistakable. The dysfunction isn't only at the top. It's bleeding through the entire chain of command, and no one is patching the wound. Here's the ugly truth they won't put on a recruitment poster. A military that doesn't trust its commander-in-chief is a military operating in the dark. And when that trust shatters, you don't get warfighting excellence. You get institutional paralysis. Planning stalls, morale sinks, readiness withers, and the enemy, external or internal, takes notice. That silence after Trump slammed the table and walked out wasn't awkward. It was existential. It told the story louder than any press release. The commander left the room, and so did the confidence. These weren't interns or political appointees sitting around that table. These were men and women forged by fire, combat-tested, battlefield-hardened, fluent in life and death calculus. They don't flinch at chaos. But they froze that day because what they saw wasn't tough leadership. It was a hollow man unraveling when confronted with the truth. And when Trump walked out, he didn't just leave behind silent. He left confirmation that the worst fears about his ability to lead were no longer speculation. They were observable fact. They weren't shocked by the insult. They were shocked by the cowardice, by the fact that the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, couldn't sit long enough to hear hard truths from the very people trained to defend him. No rebuttal, no reflection, just exit stage right. And in that instant, something broke. Not only protocol, not only tradition, but the fragile thread-binding civilian leadership to military trust. And that's not just dangerous, that's foundational collapse in real time. Let's start with the fire alarm no one in Washington wants to admit is blaring. A senior admiral, someone with stars on his shoulders and decades of battlefield credibility, looked the President of the United States square in the eye and said, "You're a disgrace." In the middle of a formal briefing in front of his peers, that's not protocol breaking down, that's command culture collapsing on itself. And in a system where respect for civilian authority is sacred, this wasn't rebellion. It was a declaration that the emperor had no uniform. The stakes weren't rhetorical. That officer put his entire career, legacy, and future on the table, because what he saw in Trump wasn't politics. It was danger. It wasn't just that things were off track. It was that they were so far gone, someone in uniform had to blow the whistle. When the people trained never to break ranks choose to speak directly to power like that, we're not in policy disagreement territory. We're in a moral rupture. This is what happens when the quiet professionals finally say enough. And how did Mr. Toughest Guy on Earth respond? With a tantrum. Not words, not leadership, just fists on the table, a red-faced retreat, and emotional combustion. No answer, no counter, no acknowledgement. Just the sound of a man exposed running from accountability like it was sniper fire. For someone who brags about strength, he folds faster than a cheap suit in the rain. Because real strength isn't volume, it's restraint. It's owning the room, not fleeing from it. This is the same guy who claims he would stare down dictators, nuke terrorists, and make America fear it again. And yet the moment a single admiral calls him out, he folds like a lawn chair in a thunderstorm. That's not grit. That's glass pretending to be granite. Strong leaders don't flee the room when truth enters it. They stay, they listen, they adapt. But Trump treats truth like it's an insurgency, and his only exit strategy is a meltdown. This wasn't a one-off emotional blip. It was part of a slow-motion implosion. Admiral Holtz's early exit wasn't about retirement. It was about resistance. Resistance to reckless orders. Resistance to political theater masquerading as strategy. And Hooley wasn't alone. From the Pacific to the Pentagon, senior officers have raised the same alarm. What Trump calls leadership, they call legally questionable. What he calls strength, they call instability wrapped in narcissism. This isn't an isolated moment. It's a pattern burned into the walls of every command center. Here's the kicker. The system designed to absorb pressure, classified briefings, internal chains, back-channel memos is fried. Military leadership no longer trusts civilian oversight, and civilian oversight no longer trusts the brass. The feedback loop has snapped. What we're watching isn't just a crack in civil-military relations. It's a full-blown communications blackout between the commander-in-chief and his commanders. And that's not only historic, it's dangerous because when truth has no place in the room, what's left is chaos in uniform. The admiral didn't merely criticize Trump, he delivered a moral indictment. He pointed straight at the rot, a president who uses soldiers as stage props but treats their sacrifice like background noise. And if you think this was just a one-off jab, think again. We've heard this song before.
Gold Star families, veterans groups leaked briefings where Trump reportedly asked what was in it for them when referring to fallen heroes.
This wasn't a rogue officer losing his cool. It was the boiling point of years of insult. This confrontation wasn't spontaneous combustion. It was a fire built over years of casual disrespect lit by a long fuse of arrogance. For anyone in the defense community, this moment was inevitable. From snubbing war graves to bragging about bone spurs, Trump has made his disdain for service culture painfully clear. The admiral's outburst wasn't personal. It was institutional. It told every soldier watching that their oath means more to the military than a president's ego ever will. Now here comes the political wreckage. Trump's campaign has always relied on a fantasy. The myth that he's a warrior president, adored by troops, saluted by generals, and feared by enemies. But when a high-ranking officer calls him a disgrace on the record, that illusion disintegrates. You can't play G, I, Joe in campaign ads while your actual generals are pulling the fire alarm. And here's the kicker. The people who've seen his decisions up close aren't saluting. They're sounding the sirens. If you're a voter who genuinely cares about national security, here's a thought. Maybe listen to the generals who've worn the uniform, not the guy in a suit pretending to be General Patton on Truth Social. When military brass sits frozen in stunned silence, you know something has gone catastrophically off the rails. This wasn't a room full of bureaucrats. These are the people who've coordinated black ops-led battalions and buried friends. And what froze them, watching their commander-in-chief unravel like a discount reality show contestant. These men weren't shocked by combat zones or terrorist threats. They were shocked by a man so fragile he couldn't withstand a single sentence of truth without running away. That silence wasn't hesitation. It was recognition. The kind of dead air that fills a room when people suddenly realize the entire chain of command has been compromised by a toddler with a temper. They saw in real time that the office of the presidency wasn't a pillar. It was a powder cake. And here's where the rubber meets the tarmac. The damage isn't symbolic, it's strategic. When military leaders are forced to tiptoe around the president's ego, we lose clarity in war rooms. We lose coherence in crisis. Do we really think these generals can plan for Taiwan, Thran, or the South China Sea when their top concern is whether the guy in the Oval Office will throw a fit over a briefing slide? Readiness doesn't die on the battlefield. It dies in rooms like that one. When soldiers look up the chain of command and see chaos instead of clarity, you don't get discipline. You get disillusionment. Morale isn't just about paychecks or medals. It's about knowing the man at the top has your back, not just his own fragile ego. And let's be blunt. That trust didn't erode slowly. It imploded. The incident at Marine Corps University wasn't a flare-up. It was a full-blown warning shot that the foundation between civilian authority and uniformed services cracked wide open. And here's the kicker. Some magadeers will scream deep state before finishing their next Bud Light. But let's ground this in reality. These aren't bureaucrats with burner accounts. These are officers who've stood post in war zones, not war rooms. They've sworn the same oath across red and blue administrations. This isn't rebellion. It's a referendum on leadership. And right now, the commander-in-chief is failing that test with flying colors. Think about it. These aren't cable news commentators or keyboard warriors. These are admirals, men who spent decades earning stars, not chasing followers. They didn't pivot into politics. They were dragged into this because what they saw behind closed doors was too dangerous to ignore. Walking away from command isn't cowardice. It's conviction, and when the very people trained to follow orders start refusing them, maybe, just maybe, it's not the troops who are out of line. So here we are. A decorated admiral looked the commander-in-chief straight in the eye and said what half the country has been thinking. And he did it in a room full of medals and stars, not microphones and crowds. Trump's response wasn't leadership. It wasn't resilience. It was a table-slamming, foot-stomping temper tantrum that would embarrass a high school debate team. And don't miss this. Seasoned generals are choosing early retirement not because they're tired, but because they refuse to be accessories to presidential recklessness. That's not resignation, that's resistance. This isn't a one-off disagreement. It's a five-alarm fire in the engine room of America's civil-military relationship. For decades, we've depended on a fragile balance. Civilians set the mission and the military executes with professionalism. But Trump blew that up with napalm. Now we're watching readiness tank, morale plummet, and trust evaporate. Meanwhile, his campaign machine keeps pumping out flag-waving ads about loving the troops. While the actual troops are quietly sounding the alarm, you can't salute the flag while setting fire to the institution behind it. Let's be clear. This moment should make every American pause regardless of whether there's an R, D, or I next to your name. Because once military loyalty is politicized, once trust is replaced by fear or flattery, you're not defending democracy anymore. You're play acting it. And when an admiral risks his career to say face to face that the president is a disgrace, it's not about one man. It's about a system teetering on the edge where honor is punished and silence is rewarded. Ask yourself what happens the next time the chain of command is tested. When the very people trained to detect threats say the real danger is sitting in the Oval Office, you don't brush that off. These aren't Twitter warriors or political pundits. They're battlefield-hardened leaders who bled under the flag and buried their own. And now they're speaking louder than ever, not in press releases, but in resignations, withheld salutes, and cold stares across the chain of command. Ask yourself, why are the quiet professionals suddenly loud? Sure, the image is dramatic. A table slam, a walk out a room full of stars, frozen in disbelief. But beneath the theatrics is a rot far more dangerous than any outburst. This isn't about optics. It's about a total collapse in the confidence that keeps America's civilian-military partnership functional. When flag officers start looking at the president the way they look at a hostile foreign power, we're in deep institutional peril. No amount of support our troops' merch can hide that stench. Here's the uncomfortable truth. No slogan, no ad buy, no fire-breathing rally will undo what the military already sees. And what they see is a president so out of his depth, so allergic to accountability that even the steadiest hands in our national security infrastructure are hitting the panic switch. This moment at Marine Corps University isn't isolated. It's a rupture. And if you think this ends with one slam table, you're not paying attention to the silent rebellion building in the Pentagon's back hallways. And do you really think that admiral was the last to speak up? Think again. The silence is breaking. And it's not coming from partisans. It's coming from decorated professionals who've had enough Retirements aren't career moves anymore. They're acts of resistance. And every time Trump screams support the troops on stage while generals quietly step away, the hypocrisy burns a little brighter. When truth collides with ego, only one survives. It won't be the guy with the table tantrum. This isn't a blip in the news cycle. It's a systemic rupture, one that leaves a scar across the civil-military alliance we've spent decades stitching together. When a commander-in-chief treats loyalty like a mirror instead of a mission, he loses the room and the nation loses stability. We're not just watching a political crisis. We're watching a leadership void echo into the future, one broken salute at a